He needed just the one law. One law, the basis for 1,000 cultures, 1,000,000 cultures. Because, for some crazy reason, the gods love diversity. Never make two things alike. "Good heavens," one of the gods said when he saw that man had awakened to life in the community of life. "How are we to frame the one law young Homo needs in order to live 1,000,000,000 years?" "That's only half of it," another says. "Assuming we can figure out how to frame such a law, how are we to teach it to him?" Terrible problems. The gods scratch their heads. One offers a suggestion. "Young Homo has a fairly adequate sort of language, I understand. Why don't we learn that language, and then, when we've written the law, we can translate it into his language for him?" The others nod enthusiastically. But one of them says, "Wait a bit. You know very well what sort of limitations human language has. You can't say anything in it that means absolutely one thing and only one thing and nothing else." "That's true," the others agree gloomily. "Anything whatever you say in human language is subject to interpretation, to being fiddled with and twisted this way and that." "I'm afraid," says another, nodding, "that if you lined up 1,000 humans and said something very simple like, 'Thou shalt not kill,' you'd get 1,000 different interpretations of what it means. For that matter, even I don't know what it means now that I put it into human language." They tug on their beards moodily. They wring their hands hopelessly. Imagine something different from that. Gods who were not bunglers. Gods who knew their business. Gods who knew how to take care of culture builders as well as they knew how to take care of hive builders and burrow builders. Gods who knew how to give man what he needed. A law was in readiness. It had already been written. It had been written billions of years before, where the gods write what they write. You know where the gods write what they write. Not on clay tablets or papyrus. I'm not talking about bunglers here. I'm talking about competent gods. Gods who shaped a universe that has worked for 15 billion years. You know where they write what they write. You know where they wrote the law of gravity. In the fabric of matter itself. It was written there from the beginning. It lay hidden there, where it was written, for 15 billion years. It was unnoticed, unthought of, yet obeyed. No one even guessed it was there. Until one day someone sitting, at least in fancy, under an apple tree, watched an apple fall to the ground. He looked dumbfounded at the apple, at the ground. His jaw dropped. "Good Lord," he said, "it's a law. When we walk, we are following a law." And realizing that the law was a law, he changed the course of history. The law I'm talking about is a law like that. A fundamental law of the biological community, as the law of gravity is a fundamental law of matter. It's written in the very fabric of the living community, as the law of gravity is written in the very fabric of matter. Written there in the living community from the very beginning of life. It lay hidden there where it was written for 4 billion years. It was unnoticed, unthought of, yet obeyed. No one even guessed it was there. Until one day, someone sitting, at least in fancy, beside the carcass of a deer, watched the flies swarming over it. Dumbfounded, he looked at the deer, at the flies. His jaw dropped. "Good Lord," he said, "it's a law. When we live, we are following a law." Realizing that the law was a law, he might have changed the course of history if he had been a member of Homo Magister. If the discoverer of this law had been a member of Homo Magister, he, or perhaps she, would have rocked the civilized world and won himself a rich damnation. The damnation that fell on the heads of Copernicus and Darwin would have seemed like benedictions compared to the damnation that would have fallen on his. The Nobel Prize Committee might have detested him, but they could not have withheld the accolade. His name would now be a household word like Freud or Darwin or Einstein. But he wasn't a member of Homo Magister, or she wasn't. He or she was an Iqaluit Eskimo living in one of the most remote and barren areas on Earth, the Great Barrens of Canada. All the members of this small, modest people knew that the law was a law by the time Homo Magister got around to them. They thought nothing of it, no more than we think of the law of gravity. It seemed obvious to them, the way the law of gravity seems obvious to us. They spoke of it in passing to Homo Magister to explain why they lived as they did, to explain why they didn't care to live as he did. He smiled and patted them on the head. They were only savages after all. They hadn't gone to the right schools, hadn't read the right books. They didn't know the history, philosophy, theology, biology, and anthropology they needed to know in order to make Homo Magister recognize that what they discovered was a law. The law was more than all of those things to them. It was sublime poetry. And so they spoke to Homo Magister in poetry. And so he smiled and patted them on the head, and then he destroyed them. They called it the law of life. It sounds almost too good to be true, but that's what they called it. It really couldn't have been called anything else any more than the law of gravity could be called anything else. It is the law of life, followed everywhere in the seas, on the shores, in the forests, in the ponds, on the plains, in the deserts. Followed by everything that moves in the community of life, great and small, naked and armored, scaled and feathered, spined and spineless, brainy and brainless, by paramecia and elephants and sharks and grasshoppers and frogs and wolves and ticks and deer and rabbits and turtles and owls. It's a universal law, written where only the gods could have written it, in the fabric of the living community. And so a law was in readiness for Homo habilis. A single law, a biological law, but not merely a biological law, a sublime law, the pattern for 1,000,000 cultures, no two alike, as it is the pattern for 1,000,000 species, no two alike. A law good enough to be the basis for 1,000,000,000 years of cultural experimentation. A law never to be outworn or outgrown, because it had been written by gods who were actually gods and not blunderers.